And our speaker is Professor Alan Lenzi from Religious Studies. And he'll be talking to us about Babylonian suffering, if I'm correct, in a nutshell. And I've known Alan for a very long time, even though our expertise is kind of very different. But we've been sitting on committees together quite a lot, and there are issues that we very much agree with, and there are issues that we are totally on the opposite sides, but it's been always wonderful working with him, and he's a great guy to have, a great professor to have an interesting discussion with. So even if your major is in the natural sciences, this is one of those seminars where you get a glimpse at something that you may not take in your major, but you may want to explore in your minor. Okay, so if you're interested in this, please talk to Professor Lenzi, and then maybe you can explore more than just the natural sciences or engineering. So with that, let me introduce Professor Lenzi, and the big hand, and he will talk about suffering.
I'm not going to use the mic, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me. I've got a fairly loud voice. My talk is a little bit scripted, so I'm going to read a little bit. But I have to correct one thing. I actually do very little teaching around my specialty, which is I'm an ancient Near Eastern scholar. I was trained at Brandeis University. And basically I know all these ancient languages and I read all these ancient texts. I was trained in the study of words, philology, and along the way I picked up expertise in the area of Old Testament Hebrew Bible, and so I fit pretty well in the religious studies department, especially 13 years ago when I came here, when it was religious and classical studies. I was hired as a bridge between the two departments. And then the classicists retired, and nobody was hired to replace. So I'm kind of a bridge to nowhere. But that's okay. So I teach a lot of religious studies classes like comparative religion, introduction to the academic study of religion. But occasionally I get to do something that I was trained in, like I do an Old Testament Hebrew Bible class almost every year. And when I teach PAX 2, I do something called Myth Conceptions Old and New, where we look at Mesopotamian mythology and then American mythology. Occasionally, I will teach a class called Ancient Egypt in the Near East, which we cover 3,000 years of history. And a new class that I'm doing this year is called Jerusalem Through the Ages. And we're just looking at Jerusalem from the earliest attestation in Egyptian execration texts around the 18th dynasty to basically yesterday. And we're doing that in 15 weeks. So those are the kinds of things I teach. But if you're interested in my research, come and see me. I'd be happy to sit and talk shop with anybody. If you're interested in learning Babylonian, convince the dean that you can get about 13 other people interested, and maybe we could offer a class. So tonight's talk is the uses of a Babylonian story of suffering, or, and I'm thinking back to the old cartoons with Rocky and Bullwinkle, you guys may not have ever heard of those guys, or learn from my example the reception of Ludlil Belnamiki. And Ludlil Belnamiki is the title of this ancient poem that me and maybe like 2 other people in the world care about. Okay, so I write a book about it, then he writes a book about it, and he reviews my book, and I review his book, and then we just we actually met, and now we're friends. So he's all right. And anyway, Ludlil Belnamiki is a poem of perhaps 600 lines originally. And the word perhaps there is really important. We actually don't know how long this poem is. It's not fully recovered. So there are breaks in the text, so you'll be reading along and there's a break. And you don't know what the next word is because it's not preserved. But there are also gaps So you'll be reading along and the tablet just breaks off. And that's just the way it is. I've recently written a survey of Babylonian literature, and there's this really great myth where this guy gets on the back of an eagle, he's flying up to heaven, and the tablet breaks. And it's been broken since the 19th century. So we've all been on this cliffhanger waiting for, how does this story end? I don't know. Maybe my grandson or grandkids or 200 years from now, maybe the tablet will show up. So Ludlow Babalonian is 600 lines long, we think. We estimate. Me and about 2 other people in the world who care about it. It's written in 5 what we call standardized tablets. You might think of these 5 tablets as something like chapters. In Standard Babylonian Akkadian. Standard Babylonian Akkadian is not the language of the man on the street. Standard Babylonian Akkadian is a literary language. You might think of it something like Latin during the time of the Renaissance. Okay, so it's a very literary language, highfalutin. We think the poem was written during the late 2nd millennium BCE, 1200 BCE. We think. We actually can't prove it. All 67 known manuscripts, and by manuscripts I basically mean tablets and tablet fragments. There are 67, and all of them come from archaeological contexts that are hundreds of years after 1200 BCE. Most of them are from the time period about 800 to 300 BCE, so the poem is actually preserved hundreds of years after its time of composition. This would be kind of like discovering Shakespeare today. If you think about how long ago Shakespeare wrote his plays. All right? So that's sort of the situation historically. The poem presents a first-person retrospective account of suffering and deliverance of a man, and I'm going to tell you his name, but you have to promise me you will not name your children this. The man's name is Shubshi Meshre Shakan. Can you imagine calling that kid to dinner? Okay, so Shubshi Meshre Shakan is our protagonist. Near the beginning of the poem, we learn that Marduk, the high god of Babylon's pantheon, had gotten angry with Shubshi Meshre Shakan and subjected him to tremendous suffering in the form of social alienation. Maybe I should advance this. Social alienation in the first tablet and physical affliction in tablet 2. The man laments his condition extensively, and I mean really extensively. Even doubts the justice of the gods. And I would argue that this is one of the very first articulations of agnosticism in world literature. Because he says, how do I know what's good? How do I know what the gods even care about? It's a very interesting passage. Eventually, after a series of revelatory dreams, Marduk has mercy on the sufferer, restores his physical well-being and social standing. Despite this nearly unbearable suffering, the protagonist never repudiates Marduk. In fact, quite to the contrary, he praises the deity throughout the poem and offers himself up as an example of pious patience. Now, if you're biblically literate, you might be hearing some resonance here with the character in the Bible. Anybody know? Job. No, that's not the Sunday school answer. Jesus is always right in Sunday school, but we're not in Sunday school. So Job, right. So one of the things that I've done a lot of is compare this poem to Job. If you're interested, you can find my academia.edu page, and you'll see some of my writing there. Although often classified as speculative wisdom, that is a kind of narrative treatment of a philosophical topic, I've argued in my own research that Ludlow Babalonian has some quite practical purposes. That is, I think the text was used to produce specific social-oriented outcomes in the communities that accepted the text as culturally significant. Now, culturally significant, what does that mean? I'm not talking about this text as if it were scripture, or even that it was canonical. Both of those terms are very weighted. But rather, just simply at the level of the poem is regarded high enough by its transmission community to deem it worthy of learning and knowing. So if you're an educated person, you would know this poem. Sort of like how every freshman has to read. You guys still, freshman year in high school, did you read Romeo and Juliet? Okay, see, there you go. Ludlow. The poem's quite clearly doxological, that is, it's hymnic, and has a religious import in that it exalts the god Marduk's sovereignty and divine will. The poem's also ideological in that a cluster of broad themes in the poem functions as a kind of protection for the institution and practitioners, and don't be alarmed by the term, but practitioners of exorcism. These are ritual experts tasked with maintaining proper relations between humans and unseen powers. Not just the gods, but demons, witches, and other kinds of unseen scary things. Woodville shielded these ritual experts from charges of inefficacy due to ritual failure. And if you're interested in that, I can give you a paper and you can read it. It's recently published. So, finally, I will argue tonight that the poem has a pedagogical purpose, not just the ideological purpose, not just the doxological purpose, but a pedagogical purpose. That is, the poem challenges readers to learn from the suffering and recovery of the poem's protagonist, and to develop this idea, I'm going to discuss the reception of Ludlow in three texts. That is, how are these three texts, how do they use Ludlow in their own content? And then I'm going to show how the poem served a pedagogical purpose in each of those three texts. I begin with a previously identified allusion to Ludlow in a Neo-Assyrian letter known as the Forlorn Scholar, and I'll talk about the chronology of these texts as I introduce them. This forms a kind of warm-up for a fuller discussion of a previously identified citation of Ludlow in a royal inscription from the Neo-Babylonian king Nabonidus. Finally, I'll turn my focus to a royal inscription from Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, that draws on Ludlow in a much more subtle fashion. But in all three texts, I consider why is Ludlow invoked in these texts, and how does this invocation serve the text's rhetorical purpose? And by invoke, I have to give this little caveat. It's not like the poem of these other three texts say, as Ludlow says. I've identified these allusions because it looks like those texts are sort of citing Ludlow. There's a very famous line in the very first Star Wars that came out when I was like 6 years old. These aren't the droids you're looking for, right? You've heard this. Dominic, you've heard this.
I've heard it.
These aren't the droids you're looking for, right? Now, if you came to me and I said, can you turn in your paper today? And you get ready to hand me something and you go, this is not the paper you're looking for. I think I would pretty clearly know that you were making a Star Wars reference, right? Probably? Of course. So this is how I identify allusions to Ludlow. I know the text well, you're reading other texts, and it just sort of pops out. Okay. So how does the invocation serve the text's rhetorical purpose, and how does this invocation exemplify what I've called the pedagogical purpose of Ludlow? So in some, my talk attempts to look at the reception of Ludlow Belnamiki in these three texts with a view to determine how people who felt they were suffering unjustly adopted and applied the protagonist's charge in Ludlow to learn from my example. But before I go down that path, before we introduce any of the three texts, I want to talk to you guys about what I mean by pedagogical. Because what you might be thinking is education, right? You might be thinking, oh, we're talking about the classroom setting, teaching. But if my intention was to utilize this definition of the term pedagogical in that sense, I would draw your attention to the fact that scribal instructors required their students to learn Ludlow. I've kind of already mentioned this, but in the scribal curriculum of the first millennium Babylonia, say between 800 and 300, we have 15 tablets that are very clearly, without a doubt, scribal instruction tablets. These are student work. They actually have a different physical appearance than, say, a library tablet found in a temple or a library tablet found at a palatial archive, like the famous Library of Nineveh under Ashurbanipal's rule. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So these 15 tablets comprise nearly 1/4 of the 67 tablets that attest the poem. And after her careful study of the hundreds of scribal exercise tablets from First Millennium Babylonia, Petra Geshe concluded that scribes learned Ludlow in the second stage of their education, a stage in which one of the major learning outcomes, and I apologize for that term to my colleagues, was a deeper enculturation into the Babylonian religious and political ideology. In other words, education was used for propagandistic purposes, and Ludlow was part of that propaganda. Students acquired this acculturation by way of copying out the classics of the age, texts that included a number of prayers, incantations, a standardized list of Babylonian religious structures, and here's one for you Harry Potter fans, an anti-witchcraft ritual series called Maklud, an exorcistic self-praising hymn called Marduk's Address to the Demons, and of course you all know the well-known creation account, the Babylonian creation account everybody knows, Anume Elish. Of course, everybody knows that one, right? So if you took my Old Testament class, you'd have to read part of it. All of these and others were learned in addition to Ludlow, within the scribal curriculum. And you might think, well, that's the pedagogical purpose that I'm thinking of. Well, no, it's not. I'm going to call that the curricular context, the curricular use of Ludlow. Now, because of Ludlow's literary standing in training scholars, training would-be scholars, scribal students, scholars created a commentary to explain its difficult words and sometimes referred to lines in the poem to explain difficulties in other texts. Such a curricular use of Ludlow is not actually the meaning of pedagogical, but rather it demonstrates beyond dispute that Ludlow was well known among the highly literate scribes who would go on to become court scholars. And that is an essential historical component to my argument. I'm not asserting that, hey, look, there's 67 tablets. I mean, if you think about it, 67 tablets for almost 1,000 years of literary history, that doesn't seem like much. But a quarter of them come from a scribal context, a curricular scribal context. It's student work. And when you recognize that, and you recognize the commentary, and you recognize the literary stages of the larger scribal curriculum, you begin to see that Ludlow was actually well distributed. And one thing that I haven't mentioned, the 67 tablets are from about 6 or 7 different archaeological sites scattered throughout what is today called modern Iraq, Mesopotamia. Okay, so we're fairly confident that this poem was well known. So the curricular use of Ludlow proves this story was integrated into the scribe's version of what socio-narratologist Arthur Frank calls narrative habitus, which does 4 things. So narrative habitus, according to Arthur Frank, involves a repertoire of stories that a person at least recognizes and that a group shares. And I just referenced Star Wars as what a lot of people, I mean, a lot of you know this, right? It's part of our repertoire. Narrative habitus provides the competence to use this repertoire as embodied and mostly tacit knowledge. You don't have to tell people, I'm now going to quote Shakespeare, to be or not. You just know because you're literate, right? Narrative habitus disposes a person's tastes in stories. And this is why as soon as a really popular television series comes out, what do people do? They're knockoff. There are copycats, right? Finally, and this is the really important one, narrative habitus predisposes a sense of the right and fitting resolution toward which a half-told story ought to progress. Narrative habitus really shapes your psyche. The stories that are part and parcel of our culture. And so I'm going to argue that Ludlow is part and parcel of their narrative habitus. It shapes people so that it actually comes out in the texts they produce. Not just copying Ludlow, but in their own texts. So now I'm going to say that that's not how I'm defining pedagogical either. So please forgive me, I'm going to come back to this context. But what I want to propose is something even more intense. And I don't have a slide for this more intense part. So Ludlow, I argue, and its protagonists were intended to be a model or an example for how one ought to behave toward the gods and ought to respond to unfavorable situations that arise in life. So one might better describe this use of Ludlow as mythically paradigmatic, in that the text provides a normative or binding or prescribed model or pattern for proper human behavior in the face of deity-inspired and deity-directed suffering. Now, deity-inspired and deity-directed is really important. Woodwell does not mince its words. The deity is behind the suffering. The deity causes the suffering, period. And I would argue that the book of Job does the same thing. You want suffering? Here you go. Now I know we can argue about the book of Job, but in the end, I'd argue the same thing. So although Woodwell is a retrospective account of an individual's suffering, it is not simply a description of what happened. It's not just a narrative poem, even though that's the way it reads. What I argue is the account of what happened is told so the audience will know what to do and what to expect from Marduk, and what Marduk will do when he imposes unfavorable situations upon a person. You see what I'm arguing here? The story should shape its reader's experience of unfavorable situations. That's what I think is the intention of Woodwell. The text of the poem commends this kind of prescriptive, pedagogical, paradigmatic purpose for peace. Thank you. Explicitly in a number of passages. First among which is the final quatrain of the opening hymn. If we were to expect the purpose of the poem to be announced somewhere, we might very well expect it to be announced at the end of the introduction. Where do you put your thesis statement in your essays? Right? So, tablet 1, tablet 1, 37 to 40. I can unpack that metaphor if you want to ask me in the question time. But I, who ate mud like a fish, will extol his, Marduk, I will extol his anger. Now think about that for a moment. The guy says he's looking back on his time of suffering. He introduces his narrative poem with, I'm going to praise Marduk's anger. That was directed at me. All right, let that sink in for a moment. He, Marduk, quickly bestowed favor on me, just as he revived the dead. I will teach the people their plea for favor is near. May his favorable invocation carry off their break. That word is broken. And I have a little anecdote about this. You see me, I've got sin there with a question mark. I'm pretty sure it's probably the word for sin. I was at a symposium in Berkeley 10 years ago. We were all looking at the only tablet that attests that part of that phrase. And someone said, we've got the tablet up on screen. Someone said, I think that's the R sign. And I'm like, I don't know. No, I think it's the R sign. I said, maybe you're right. And then someone said, oh, I think I see the Na sign. So we convince ourselves that we see Arna, which of course everybody knows is the Akkadian word for sin. So we're like, yeah, that's what we expect. And man, the reviewers came down on me hard for that. Wow, I put that in my text edition, and of course there's this old German guy at the Roman Pontifical Biblical Institute who just writes, Nein. You know, no. Was ist das? Right, so now I put it in brackets because I've convinced myself that I didn't see it. And Takeyoshi Yoshima and I have gone back and forth about this, and we've, did our little nerdy thing with measuring the signs and what could have been, and look at that scratch, and it gets kind of crazy. We're very big nerds. So, anyways, this is the opening. This is how the opening hymn ends, and it seems to me that the poet is intending to teach people. The sufferer announces the intention to teach the people that Marduk does not ignore their plea for favor. Marduk's answer simply has not yet arrived. When it does, Marduk will release their sin and restore them, just as he did for the sufferer speaking in the poem. And I just realized I don't have it. Oh, there's a copy. Okay, good. All right, second passage. Let the one who was negligent of Ace ideal, this is Marduk's main temple in Babylon, learn from my example. This is the phrase that's in the title, my alternate title, learn from my example. So again, the sufferer clearly offers himself as an exemplary human, not for his virtue, but for his enduring a difficult circumstance as a recipient of divine anger and then mercy. And then finally, there's a more subtle example here. In the last tablet, in the last part of the poem, the citizens of Babylon saw how he, Marduk, revived his servant, Shukshi Mashur Shakhan. Every one of their mouths extolled his greatness, saying, And then we have a long hymn to Marduk, praising him for restoring the guy that he imposed his suffering upon. About a dozen lines. You might suggest that the sufferer, Shukshimeshre Shakhan, has become a kind of poster child of Marduk's mercy. The implicit message is that such is typical of Marduk's character. No one should expect anything less from the deity. Based on these passages, specifically in the poem's general thrust, which, if you're interested in reading my translation, there's a link in the Honor Seminar booklet, I think there's a general pedagogical intention to the poem to shape the reader's experience of how they should endure their own suffering, how they should learn from Shukshimeshre Shakhan. I don't want to go there yet. All right, so now let's move on to our three texts. Given our strong dependence upon the textual record for the reconstruction of ancient Mesopotamian social history, in fact, although we have archaeology, the texts from ancient Mesopotamia are basically our major source of understanding the history. You might ask, how many tablets? Anybody want to ask, how many tablets are there, Dr. Lenzi? Yeah, there are a freaking truckload ton. I mean, there's just so many tablets. It's unbelievable. So there's an institute down at UCLA, and they're trying to catalog every single known cuneiform tablet in the world. I think there are currently 500,000 records, and they know that they're not even close to finished. There's probably about 1 million cuneiform tablets in the world's museums, and there are probably about 100 million tablets in the ground over there still, awaiting future generations of archaeologists. Maybe not 100 million, but there's a lot of tablets. So we rely on these for just about everything you want to know. So yes, there are archaeologists who look at buildings and clay bricks and artifacts. But when you do Mesopotamian studies, everybody learns Babylonian. Everybody learns the cuneiform script and basically learns to read tablets. So if we want to understand Ludlil's literary impact, there's only really one measure, and that is we have to look at how other literate individuals utilize the text in their own texts. So the first text I want to look at is this, and by the way, when you do Babylonian stuff, you learn that people don't really name stuff very well. It's SAA 10-294 is the name of the text. And I can tell you what that means, but it wouldn't mean anything to you. Simo Parkula named the text The Forlorn Scholar. All right, so that's a better name. This is a letter. This is a one-off letter. The author is a scholar named Urad Gula. Again, probably not a name all of you are going to rush out to name your kids. He writes to his former employer, the king of Assyria, Ashurbanipal. We basically know a lot about Urad Gula. He wrote a lot of letters. And we know a lot about Ashurbanipal. He was a Neo-Assyrian king, and his rule ends sometime around 627 BCE. 627. So Urad Gula is writing shortly before the end of that king's reign. He's writing about his unemployed situation and to ask for support. Finnish scholar Simo Parkula studied the letter and calls it The Forlorn Scholar in an article published in 1987, where he noted the letter's literary artifice and a number of allusions to Babylonian literary texts. And from this he concluded that Urad Gula was a very learned individual. Years later, Israeli scholar, the late Israeli scholar Victor Horovitz, noted a subtle allusion to Ludlil 2, chapter 2, line 32, in the front part of this letter. The letter's lines 29 and 31. And here you can see that Urad Gula writes, Hanashu Kadaru Upuluch Tashakali, Urdesha Zikni Usharichi Usamid, Minu Inalibi Achzaku. Which, for those of you not conversant in Babylonian, I've taught the servants, both courtiers and eunuchs, prostration, compliance, and respect for the palace. What did I gain from it? And by the way, the word compliance there has a question mark and has a very long footnote in my paper because we actually don't know what the word means. Compliance is my philologically best guess. It's not a guess, but I mean it's the best I can do based on the etymology and philology and grammar, etc. So Hurwitz argues that the first sentence contains an allusion to Liddell 232, which I have put down there at the bottom. I have taught the servant, oh, excuse me, I put it at the top. Right?
Oh, at the top right.
There we go. All right. So, Herbert Gula's letter is very similar to Liddell 232. There are only two places in Akkadian literature where we have Paluktu Akali, that phrase. It only occurs in these two texts. Out of all the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tablets, it only appears in these two texts. That may be a coincidence, but maybe not. Also, there are only two places where that phrase is used with the causative stem of lamadu. We see usamid, and then, did I put it up there? Ushalmid. Yeah, usamid and ushalmid are basically the same thing. One is just a Neo-Assyrian phonology, and the other is SB Akkadian phonology. If you didn't, that probably doesn't communicate to you. You'll have to trust me on it. My job requires a lot of grammar, kind of nerdiness. So, in fact, the only two places we find palaku, the verb, or the root of the noun paluktu, is in Liddell 232 with the causative stem of lamadu, and in one other place. So basically, Horowitz notes that the only real difference between Urad Gula's allusion to the poem and the poem itself is the specification of people being taught. You see that? So servants, both courtiers and eunuchs, whereas over in Liddell you have just the masses. Now, in Liddell, the noun is simply umanu, mass of people. In the letter, we've got this longer phrase. But that actually is something sort of interesting, because the masses, the word for masses, umanu, is a near homonym for the word scholars, umanu. Can you see the tiny print up there? Umanu masses, umanu, masters or scholars. That's exactly what Urad Gula is. He's a scholar. And so it seems as though he's taken the word umanu out of Liddell the poem and inserted the people that he teaches, namely the people at his court, the servants, courtiers, and eunuchs. So Urad Gula's citation of the line from Liddell may have been an adaptation of the phrase to the author's social context, sort of like, this is not the paper you're looking for. You see what I mean? So aside from the verbal allusion, Horowitz also points out that the entire letter recounts the author's unjust suffering, precisely as does the sufferer in Liddell. And I'm going to quote here Horowitz's interpretation. So it's kind of long, so he says, Urad Gula is essentially casting himself as the protagonist of Liddell, whom modern readers rightly call the righteous sufferer, and emphasizes that he's been done wrong. Since the king is clearly to blame for Urad Gula's woes, the out-of-favor servant is essentially equating the king with whatever capricious powers caused the suffering of the protagonist in Liddell, and that would be Marduk. But by appealing to the king for succor, Urad Gula simultaneously elevates him to the role of Marduk, who in Liddell is the preferred address for appeals and ultimate source of the sufferer's salvation. Now, for this literary ploy to be effective, both men must have known Liddell and applied to the protagonist, the sender of the letter and the receiver, Ashurbanipal himself. It seems clear to me that the pedagogical function of the poem has not only been absorbed by the author, and so we hope the receiver of the letter, it's been adapted to apply to a different servant-master relationship in the human sphere. That is, the court scholar versus the king, rather than a human being and his God. So, when one finds oneself in a desperate situation, suffering under the wrath of a superior, so goes Urad Gula's logic, one may lament and complain, just as the protagonist in Liddell did, but then also hope, as the protagonist of Liddell instructed, that in good time, your superior, Ashurbanipal in this case, who has power over you, will relent and have mercy, just as Marduk did, the protagonist in Liddell. Now, if you accept this citation, it seems that Urad Gula was paying attention in scribal class. The next example is a very clear citation of Liddell in Neo-Babylonian royal inscription. And Neo-Babylonian Empire exists basically from about 605 to 539. Anybody heard of Nebuchadnezzar? Right?
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem in 586. He is probably the most popular Neo-Babylonian king of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. Nabonidus is the guy I'm going to talk about. He is the most unpopular king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and he happens also to be the last one, and when his reign was ended, I think it ended in applause that he was stepping down. He tried to change the Babylonian pantheon from Marduk is the high god, and nope, not anymore, not for me. He wanted to exalt the moon god. The moon god's name is Sin, or Sin. Did not go over well. So if you become an emperor of a Middle Eastern empire, do not try to change the high god. It just is a really bad idea. Right. So, in this inscription, it occurs on 2 stela, stone monuments. Okay? They were found in Haran inside present-day Syria in 1956. And the guy who published the text put it out in 1958. 2 years later, a very famous Assyriologist in my field, Lambert, recognized the citation of the poem in his book, Babylonian Wisdom Literature, but nothing has been done with this little datum since 1960. And this is one of the problems in my field. Assyriologists go, oh, that's a citation of Ludlow. Well, that's interesting. My job is done. But some of us younger scholars, I'm 47, Lambert was like 90 years old the first time he asked me a question at an international conference. His first question, he raises his hand, and I said, of course I know him. I was a graduate student, and this is 2005, and he said, yes, Professor Lambert. His response at the conference was, I don't buy it. And I said, thank you for your comment, sir. And I say, what don't you buy? Any of it. Perhaps after the paper's over, I can talk to you and I can get some pointers for you because this is part of my dissertation. Yes, okay. And I sat down and somebody from Harvard, a professor from Harvard, leans over and says, you handled Lambert perfectly. So I know it's more nerdy stuff, but this is the way my field is. So he identifies this citation in 1960 and nobody does anything with it for, what, 58 years? So here comes Lenzi with an idea. So I'm giving you an outline of the text because it's much too long to put up there. So I've got 12 parts here. You can see the citation of Ludlow right there in the middle. The text has multiple columns. All right, so you get to the bottom of the stone stela and you move over and you start again, and then you move over and you make a little bit more text. And there are some breaks. Okay, somebody has destroyed part of the monument. So we don't have the entire text. But I'm going to work with what we've got. The text is a royal inscription. It exalts Nabonidus as a great king. And he recounts the events surrounding Nabonidus' reconstruction of the moon god's temple in Haran. Now remember, he's trying to change the pantheon, and it's not going so well. And the temple in Haran is called a Hul, another great name. And this task is revealed to him near the beginning of the inscription in a dream from his patron god, Sin. If Nabonidus would obey, Sin reveals to him in the dream, the king would be granted universal sovereignty. So of course he wants to obey. But the problem is the citizens aren't on board with him spending all their money on a temple to the moon god. Okay? So what do? They basically say no. They're punished for their stubbornness. Sin removes Nabonidus from the land, taking the king abroad for 10 years in a place called Tema, which has been identified in Saudi Arabia. And this is a really big deal during Nabonidus' reign. For many, 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 many decades, we had no idea why Nabonidus was in Tema for so long. And Paul Alan Lenzi, who teaches at University of Toronto, basically solved this question about 25 years ago, arguing that he was out there finding a path across the desert for the army to get to the Levant and to Egypt faster so that they could basically use it as a military route. Okay, so in any case, the king states that both Mesopotamia and the lands he lived in enjoyed enough divinely provided fecundity during these years of his absence to support the land and to do the job as king. Normally, one would think this kind of thing shows divine approval. But the land of the Babylonians were being punished for resisting the plans to build a pool. At least that's the argument of the text. Remember, he says, I'm going to build the temple, and the Babylonians say, no. So he leaves. So it seems likely that the section intends to exonerate Nabonidus of accusations of abandonment or oppression. And it basically states, even in exile, the text implies, even when his revealed task seems thwarted, the king carried out his royal duties. All right, so that's just kind of the frame of the text. After 10 years, do I have this up there? After 10 years, he comes back. The sun god, Shamash, he's called the Lord of Oracular Instruction, sends him an order. Sin says, go home. And the gods have moved the hearts of the citizens of Mesopotamia to agree finally with Nabonidus' plan to rebuild the temple. The time for Nabonidus' return is introduced with a particular phrase. You see it up there, Shudam Adanu Imlu, and then it goes on to say some other things. The point is, the appointed time has arrived. And then it gives an exact date, which will mean nothing to you, but it's sometime in early fall. So at this point, the text diverges from the narrative account of Nabonidus and puts praise to the moon god in his mouth. Okay, so there's kind of a hiatus. Oh, let's talk about sin now and praise him. And then there's a break in the text. And when the break stops, and we begin to read the text on the monument, we have an exact citation of Woodwell, word for word. It's strange. We don't get context because there's a break right before this. Did it cite more of Woodwell? Possibly. Was there something that makes us understand this citation better? Probably. But there it is nonetheless. It is identical, word for word, no changes. What's it mean? Well, I don't know. Let's see, where am I? I would argue, you can see here, my situation could not be decided by the diviner and dream interpreter. When I lay down at night, my dream was terrifying. And this is a case where the Shubshe Mesher Shakhan is basically saying, the gods weren't giving me signs anymore. And that creates more intense suffering. Because in Babylon, when something wasn't going right, you would go to the diviner, and you would say, what's the deal? Have I angered the gods? Have I done some kind of ritual misstep? Why am I suffering? Why am I sick? Why did my business fail? And the diviner would tell you. But in Woodville, the diviners, 3 times, 3.5 times I'd argue, says, we don't know. And that's a terrible feeling. I mean, imagine going to the priest and saying, Father, I've sinned. And he says, okay, what'd you do? This is what I did. Huh. Sucks to be you, man. But how many Hail Marys? Oh, I don't know. That's a hard one to say. I don't know, son. I'm sorry. You see what I'm saying? That the diviners didn't come through for him. So I assume that that's the position of Nabonidus while he's away. He has this initial dream. The people don't like it. He leaves for 10 years. And he's saying while he's gone, I don't know where I go from here. Where are the signs? But then he gets the sign from sin. And this is a turning point. This is a turning point for him in the text. And in fact, he goes on to say, the personal god and goddess who had left and were distant turned back to me and spoke well of me. He seems to think that his luck has changed. I can't go into all the details, but this passage also alludes to other places in Woodlow where the personal deities and the protective spirits abandon the sufferer, but eventually will come back. The allusion here in Nabonidus' inscription reverses what the sufferer endured in Woodlow. No longer is Nabonidus alienated from his personal deities. Moreover, the inscription immediately follows this reunion with favorable signs from the diviner, it immediately follows and says, my favorable omen was placed in the mouth of the diviner. So right after this passage in the stela, his divination comes through. He knows what he has to do, and he can act knowledgeably. So with this, Nabonidus sets his distant fiefdom in order and returns to Babylon, where he builds and dedicates the temple to Sin. And the inscription ends shortly thereafter with boasts of military success in an address to the Stele's reader, look at me, I did it. And this is very typical of Assyrian kings. At the end, they always want to say, hey, look at me, you should be like me, I'm so awesome. Okay? So success. So although Nabonidus is not presented as suffering great physical pain and social alienation, as does the sufferer in Ludlow, the royal inscription clearly depicts the king as one who suffers rejection, and that he couldn't carry out the plan that was initially given to him in a dream. The Babylonians frustrated his plan because they said basically no, they're not going to build the temple. Nabonidus confesses his frustration while he's away. He couldn't get proper signs from the gods. It's the same problem that we see in Ludlow. The sign that he could have, or would have, or wanted anyway, would have clarified when Nabonidus could carry out his task to rebuild the temple. So just as Marduk acts in Ludlow, the high god in the inscription here at Sin, acts in his own good time to orchestrate events to carry out the plan. When the appointed time arrives, the people acquiesce to Nabonidus' wishes to rebuild the Afuakul, which coincides with the return of Nabonidus' personal deities and clear oracular pronouncements. So the point's pretty obvious. The time of Nabonidus' divine alienation has ended, his subjects' proper obedience to him is restored, and just as with the ending of Ludlow, Nabonidus goes to the temple, and in fact he builds the temple and brings lavish offerings. If this interpretation is correct, the inscription has adapted the events in Ludlow to cast Nabonidus, a king, or at least to make him like the sufferer, or the protagonist of Ludlow, who suffers divine alienation and revelatory radio silence, and then in the end is restored at the deity's own choosing. So the Ludlow adaptation in the inscription is surrounded by Nabonidus' divine election and protection, in that the king is chosen to complete an initial divinely revealed task and is blessed tremendously with divine protection in battle after fulfilling it. So the intervening hardship is 10 years in Tema, the divinatory radio silence, rather than abasing or humiliating the king, actually exalts his piety, since throughout the period of hardship he relies and trusts in the sovereign wisdom of the divine benefactor, just as Ludlow suggests for its readers. The clever composer of this inscription must have been a good student in scribal school. So the final example is much more subtle. The text is called K891, but it's more easily referred to as the Lament of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal is the last great Assyrian king. His rule ends sometime around 627 BCE. And what's interesting about Ashurbanipal is that he claims to be literate, that he could read and write, which is not a very typical claim among ancient Mesopotamian kings. I've seriously wondered whether or not he actually wrote the tablet that I translated to study. K891 is a tablet that came from his library. It's possible that that king himself wrote it. And the reason I say this is because it's chock full of errors. All right? And, I mean, can you imagine his tutor? King, never mind. King, never mind. Because he's the king, right? So, Ludlow's neither explicitly cited nor clearly alluded to via textual hints or echoes. Rather, the entire lament contains themes and is structured in such a way that the text brings to mind in general, I would argue, Ludlow, and especially this passage from Tablet 2, lines 12 to 32. Now, I know it's kind of tiny print up there. I was going to read the passage, but in the interest of time, I'm going to let you try to scan it quickly. But what I want to point out here is, notice the yellow text is the sufferer's impious treatment. He's treated as though he's not a good devotee of Marduk. All right? But in fact, the blue text enumerates his pious actions. Okay? You know, I'm treated as though I don't do anything for the gods, that I don't give offerings, that I don't do the rituals. But in fact, I was really good about it. Okay, so that's the general thrust here. And by the way, right after this passage, the sufferer says, well, what the heck do the gods want? Okay, and he's exasperated. You can see that he's, maybe what I think is good, the gods think is bad. And maybe what the gods think, it's bad. Maybe I'm doing it thinking it's good. It's the first, I think, really clear articulation of a human being being tempted toward agnosticism. So in the passage, the protagonist of the poem complains about his unjust treatment and then enumerates his pious acts. So did Ashurbanipal know about this text? Yes, absolutely. 17 of 67 manuscripts of Ludlow, 17, about 25% of all known manuscripts of the poem, come from the royal archives and libraries of Nineveh. We know this. They were excavated there. They came out of the ground in Nineveh. You can go there and see the ruins. Well, I wouldn't advise it right now. This is where Ashurbanipal lived and ruled. 5 of these manuscripts also attest what's called an Ashurbanipal colophon. Now, I can't go into all the implications here, and there's a lot of debate about this. But when they have Ashurbanipal's colophon on it, these 5 tablets were certainly in his private library. And it may imply that he had something to do with writing it. It was certainly written for him, if not by him. There's no doubt he knew the poem. And remember, Urad-Gula wrote his letter to Ashurbanipal, and I would claim that that's more evidence that Urad-Gula assumed that Ashurbanipal would have known Ludlow. Okay? So, what's this text all about? Ashurbanipal's lament has a relatively simple structure, and again, I cannot believe how small that looks up there. I'm sorry for that. In the opening paragraph, he describes his renovation of 3 different cultic sites. The installation of 3 of his brothers to important posts, 1 royal and 2 priestly, and the reestablishment of funerary offerings for past kings. The units grow increasingly shorter as the description proceeds, and Ashurbanipal summarizes his actions on the second line of the backside of the tablet, where he states, "In all these ways I honored divinity and humanity, the living and the dead." And then, I lost my place. And then in the very next line, his text turns to lament, which continues until the text's end. Now, I know I presented this paper in Helsinki in August at an international meeting, and I thought, people are going to ask me this kind of general idea. Oh, this sounds sort of like Ludlow. That's not good enough. I want methodology. I want evidence. I want data. So I took every single word in that Ludlow passage, and I looked it up in a gigantic dictionary that basically has all the publications since about 1950 or 1940 in it. And it shows all the different contexts where each word is used. And then I ran it up, I did that work, and then I looked at every single word in Ashurbanipal's lament, and I looked for connections to Ludlow. There are very, very few actual verbatim connections. So this is why I have to argue this is very subtle. The text doesn't cite or even allude to the poem. I would call this a literary echo or a literary resonance. Okay, the general gist sounds to me or evokes subjectively for me the passage that I read, or I showed you before in Ludlow. So listen to what he says here on the backside of his tablet. "Why then are illness, sorrow, expenses, and loss permanently bound to me? Discord in the land, strife in the house." Discord and strife does occur in Ludlow and other passages. Strife is not withheld from me. Disturbances and evil words are constantly set out against me. Emotional and physical distress have bent my frame. I've spent my days sighing, woe and alas. I am distressed on the festival day, the day of the God of the city. Death and constraint hold me fast. I moan day and night on account of depression and lament. You think your situation is bad here in the fall semester. I'm exhausted, he says. Oh God, give these things to the one who has shown you no reverence, so I may see your light. How long, O God, will you treat me in this manner? Like one who does not revere his God and his goddess, I am treated. I know that's not great English, but I put that I am treated at the end because I was treated ends the lament section of Ludlow. So, I'm going to skip that. This one little bit of evidence, I was treated, it's not a verbatim. situation. In Ludlow, the verb is amrak, and in the lament, the verb is ipshaku. I know that means nothing to you, but they're different words. But syntactically, they're the same. They've put off the verb to the end of the whole complaint. I think that might be some evidence that Ashurbanipal, in composing his lament, is trying to recall Ludlow. And the gist of the lament is very much in keeping with the gist of Ludlow. So, admittedly, the connection I'm suggesting is rather broad. But if we draw on the idea of narrative habitus, mentioned earlier, remember that? It seems quite likely, especially given the physical presence of tablets bearing Ludlow in Ashurbanipal's personal library and Ashurbanipal's claim to literacy. He very likely read this text for himself. Ludlow is probably somewhere in the literary background of the lament of Ashurbanipal. And if so, how should we interpret its role? I suggest that Ashurbanipal is bearing witness to what constitutes the unmaking of his world. And I'm adapting a phrase from Elaine Scarry's book, The Body and Pain. By the way, in terms of books and authors, Elaine Scarry writes a book called The Body and Pain. Accident? Or did she? All right, sorry. It's a really important book on physical pain and torture, written in 1985. So Ashurbanipal's trying to express that his suffering is unmaking his world. And I suggest to you that this is a very common experience with human beings. When you suffer, your world is in some way, shape, or form unmade. Why? Because you experience the world in that bag of flesh, that bag of chemicals you call your body. Right? So Ashurbanipal must somehow make sense of his topsy-turvy world in which piety does not bring blessing. So, I'm arguing, he's cast his experience in the mold of Ludlow's protagonist, much as did Urad Gula discussed earlier, but in a more profound, if also more indirect manner. His lament dwells within the orbit of Ludlow, we might say. And one of the things Arthur Frank says about narrative habitus is that it predisposes a sense of a right and fitting solution toward which a half-told story should progress. The lament of Ashurbanipal is literally half-told. He laments. Pious acts, lament, the end. What kind of resolution do we look for? Do we hope for when we lament about our pain, about our treatment, the unfairness, the injustice? We look for healing, justice, deliverance. Ashurbanipal's lament is a half-told story. Frank says, people's sense of how plots will probably go reflects and generates their everyday common sense of which actions lead to which consequences, whether in stories or in life. People's habitus of expected plot completions is nothing less than their sense of life's possibilities. If Ashurbanipal's experience is being guided by the example of the sufferer in Ludlow, as I suspect it is, he knows not only what he's supposed to do when he suffers, complain, protest, lament, and wait, but also what is to happen afterwards, which is the arrival of divine mercy and the return of divine favor. It may be, in fact, that the very writing of this half-told story, the lament of Ashurbanipal, was intended to hasten, to elicit or hasten its completion, to bring relief and healing. If the subtle intertextual interpretation of the lament of Ashurbanipal is convincing, then we have yet another case of a scribe, perhaps Ashurbanipal himself, describing a royal figure, the king, by way of the example of the sufferer in Ludlow. So if Ludlow was as popular, I'm going to wrap it up now. If Ludlow is as popular and well-known as our manuscript evidence suggests, and if the text was used in training of scribal elites as often as the school tablets indicate, we should not be surprised to see others filtering their experience of what I call unmerited disfavor in their own text, the suffering and restoration of the poem's protagonist. Just as we cry out, when physical pain unmakes our bodies, we humans are also driven to cry out in emotional distress and intellectual confusion as that pain unmakes our understanding of the world. Anthropologist Byron Good, in his study of Medicine, Rationality, and Experience, notes that when pain and suffering threaten to systematically deconstruct or subvert the life world, this dissolution is countered by a human response to find or fashion meaning, to reconstitute the world. Putting the pain and suffering in a narrative, he claims, is a process of locating suffering in history, of placing events in a meaningful order in time. It also has the object of opening the future to a positive ending, of enabling the sufferer to imagine a means of overcoming adversity and the kinds of activities that would allow life experience to mirror the projected story. Now, if we do this today with our own suffering, as Byron has shown in his study of the narrativization of illness and pain, we should expect nothing less from our forebears in Babylonia and Assyria. Ludlow, however, did not supply such a narrative serendipitously. It wasn't an accident, I would argue. Rather, the text actively commends itself to its readers as such a text that would shape and direct, guide the experience of Babylonians in pain. When its protagonist exhorts its readers to learn from my example, apparently, and we only have texts to go by, we don't have interviews, but apparently some scribes were paying attention in class. And thank you for your attention.
And now the floor is open for questions.
Dominic?
Guys, I know that this is only the second seminar, but the questions are an integral part of every lecture, right? And you're supposed to show the same respect during the questions and during the talk. Okay?
Yeah.
All right, so you just told us about this very important text, Ludlow.
Ludlow.
Does Ludlow ever reference any text before it, though?
So you're asking if Ludlow itself alludes to other texts?
Yes, that is my question.
Yeah, so that's a difficult question because, first of all, we don't have the entire canonical corpus of all literary texts. We know this because there are tablets that would say, these are all the important texts, and they name them. And sometimes, like some of our catalogs will say, Ludlow Babalonian, and you go, oh, well, that's our text. But then there are maybe half the texts that we don't know. So I have to say that as of 2018, we don't have a really solid idea that Ludlow is citing another text verbatim. Now, is this going to go on YouTube? So, a scholar that I really respect and who taught me a lot, he called me. We got to talk about this text. I'm like, okay. So he tries to convince me that Ludlow is pulling on this other text and dropping it in like a boilerplate method. You know, take code from somewhere else and there, bam, it's on your page now. Like this text, this passage. And it was part of the passage I just showed you guys from Tablet 2, 12 and 32. And I said, thank you for your comment, and I'm good friends with him. I said, what's your proof? He said, well, look at it. And I said, no. Okay, that's cool, but what's your proof? Looking at it is not proof. And he said, it just feels like it. And I said, okay, but that's still not good enough, And he's written a paper about it, and I disagree. And he knows I disagree. I said, can I speak? I don't think so. But he thinks so. Now, there are other places where, so there's another text. There's a tablet, a Babylonian hymn to Marduk. It was found in a city called Ugarit, which is today on the coast of the Mediterranean in Syria. It was destroyed around 1200. And there's a hymn to Marduk there where one line, so we're talking about like 4 poetic words, are identical with 4 words in the last chapter of Ludlow. And some people go, look! And you're like, yeah, but it's 4 words. And what about all the rest of the context? And so I would say we don't have good evidence that Ludlow is citing earlier texts. But the way I would think about it is this. if narrative habitus is a nice model for thinking about literary production, and I think it really is, the author of Ludlow almost certainly was influenced by other texts. And if we look carefully, and I'm actually writing a book right now about this poem, I am looking like crazy for other allusions in Ludlow. And I think rather than finding allusions, what I'm finding is intellectual influence. So one of the articles I've written, I've argued that the structure of Ludlow, the laments, the restoration, the praise at the end, actually follows the structure of a common Babylonian prayer. And I developed that idea in this long, 50-page article. And so I would say it's not citing a text. Instead, it's citing and alluding to a genre. So you might think of it like this, guys. If I'm writing a story in the newspaper, and you know I'm reporting on, say the headline says presidential election, and I start by saying, once upon a time, you all know that I'm not going to tell you a fairy tale. But we all know that's how fairy tales begin. So what I'm doing is I'm alluding to a genre for a new purpose. And I think Ludlow does that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry, I don't get to choose my questions?
No, at the end of the first tablet, there was a metaphor to eating mud like fish.
Oh, yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I'm sitting at Berkeley with a bunch of, at the time I was this junior professor in 2008, and I'm leading the seminar. And we've got this person over here who's had a Guggenheim, and this person over here who's been, awarded millions of dollars, things like that. All these really highfalutin Berkeley professors. And they look at me and they say, Alan, what does this metaphor mean? And, or it's a simile, right? I who ate mud like a fish. I think it has a reference to carp. Euphrates is a river where there's carp. We know that carp are mentioned in other texts. We also know, anybody fish for carp? These are not the best fish to get because they're bottom dwellers. And I think he was basically saying, I was as low as you can go. I was sucking mud, like those fish that suck mud. See what I mean? And in his world, the river is a really important place. Because, you guys all know, of course, Mesopotamia comes from the Greek Mesos and Mesopotamia between the rivers, and you've got the Tigris and Euphrates, right? So I think it's a metaphor for I'm as low as I could get. Does that make sense in context? I think that's the answer. But of course, with literary stuff, of course, as soon as you say that, someone else, I don't buy it. Okay. Other questions? Too bad.
My understanding the premise of the poem is Seminar Suffering. But my question is, to what extent was this used by tyrants or rulers to justify putting suffering on other people?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I don't think kings had a real problem inflicting suffering on people. The Assyrians are notoriously bad about this because the Assyrians glorified their military acts. So they say, oh, look, these marauding Arabians came and they attacked this town, and, we just took them and flayed them alive and put their skins on our walls. Taught them a lesson. Or in some cases, they would take a guy, say a king, and they would chain him up at the city gate like dogs. And they would just be there until, people killed them or they died. The kings do not worry about inflicting. They're not a very humane bunch. The Babylonians did the same stuff. They just didn't write about it in their texts as much. So did they do this to their own people? You're allowed to inflict suffering on other people. Your own people you shouldn't, because the gods will get you for that. So I think Ludlow was, it wasn't a warrant for kings to oppress their own people. And the gods would get the king if he tried to oppress his own people too much. I don't believe in any of those gods, so, I think that's all mumbo jumbo. But that was their worldview. So I don't think Ludlow was part of a tyrannical royal ideology. There's plenty of royal ideology justifying the kings asking people to go to war or, doing this, that, or the other thing. And the kings, even to their own people, could be pretty harsh taskmasters. But their job was to provide for their kingdom. And when the kingdom when things didn't go well in the kingdom, the buck stopped with the king. What did the king do wrong? And so this is where the exorcists were like, oh, king, that's a bad omen. Don't do that. You shouldn't go outside the gate. And so, yeah, Ludlow wasn't really responsible for the harsh treatment of people. That's a good question, though, because it is a propagandistic text. Sean had a question.
You talked about how when you publish your works, you have a few editors that read your work and give you feedback. How do you deal with those literary criticisms?
First, you cry. No, I mean, look. You would rather see it before your article goes into print. So when W.G. Lambert raised his hand at a conference and says, I don't buy it, that hurt. It was public. But, I was a grad student. He was like 85 years old. And, he was like the world's foremost scholar. In some ways, I should be flattered that he would even talk to me, right? But you really, as a scholar, and I would say, I think Ballant and other scholars in the room and scientists in the room will say the same thing, you have to develop a tough skin. I mean, it's like reading student evaluations, but worse. You got all these students that say, oh, he's totally great, he's awesome, give him a raise, and you want to take him to the dean, and then you get the one that, how'd he do? 0. What would you change about this class? Everything. Or even worse, the professor. Oh, dang. So, how do I respond? So, I told you guys, you're in my Tax 1 class, and I told you guys that I got peer review on my Babylonian survey of literature, right? And it's probably going to get a contract. I got 2 peer reviewers. Both were pretty good. They were good reviews. They had some things I'm going to do some revision. I'll turn it in January. I have had other times where, you remember the German guy in the Pontifical Biblical Institute that says, 9. He didn't like my restoration of that one word. He is also the guy who I sent him a tablet and I said, hey, I found this in the British Museum. I want to publish it. I want to publish it in your journal that you edit. Here's my draft of my paper. And I wrote in English, he wrote in German. He wrote back, and he basically told me this old German saying, ich nehme kein Blatt vor den Mund. I mean, I don't put a piece of paper in front of my mouth, which literally doesn't communicate to us. But what he meant was, I'm a straight talker. And if you can't take it, then forget about it. And I wrote back and I said, you write whatever you want on my paper, I will listen. Because he is the God of Mesopotamian prayers. And so he said, okay. And when I got the marginal feedback, he was like, das ist schlecht. Which means, that's terrible. I'm like, okay. So, you deal with it. Look, there are times. When you get reviews like that, that's good. What you don't want is for that guy to say that stuff in print after your book is done. And you can't go back and steal every copy and erase that idiotic thing you said that somehow made it through. People say, what was wrong with you? I don't know. I was dumb that day. I wrote something stupid. So you have to really develop thick skin. And guys, this is not just for scholars. Professionally, you will have to develop a thick skin. You will inevitably get bad reviews. If you're a dentist, if you're a doctor, if you're a professor, there are websites where people dump on you. And so, get ready. Don't let this fire.
If I can add to it, that's what you get in knowledge. So it actually, it's surprising me how similar it is, because we get the same thing. Very recently in a paper, there was a reviewer who kept insisting, and it was a back and forth with the editor, that we should reference and elaborate on something, referencing a paper which is clearly his, and it was wrong. And in the end, we refused to do it. And I saw, I have to say this because you get it. There was this cartoon where it was, it says something of, there was a skull, like the one you dig out, and it said underneath man. And then identifying with woman, and then straight, gay, white, black, and it was all the same skulls. And then the last line there was reviewer 2. There was a skull that was bashed in. All right, there was another question somewhere here. Yeah.
So going back to the other text that the other scholar thought Google was citing, if that text was being cited, could it be argued that the lament was echoing that previous text and not Google, since it was from that specific part?
Since Google was writing the Ashurbanipal, the Ashurbanipal was actually referencing his letter rather than Ludlow? Is that what you're saying?
That Ashurbanipal was in the lament was referencing the previous text that the text that the other scholar thought Ludlow was referencing, and you note that precursor to Ludlow was part of Ashurbanipal's letter.
Oh, so my scholar friend who thought did that. So he couldn't point to a text. He said, I think that it's from another text that's been dropped into the poem of Ludlow. And I said, what text? And he said, well, we don't know. I don't have any evidence for that. So my argument is always, anytime you're doing any kind of intertextuality or literary borrowing or allusion, whether it's in English or German or French or Babylonian, there's always going to be a measure of uncertainty. Unless you interview the author and say, were you referring to Ludlow? And unless you can do that, you may not be able to establish authorial intention. So my idea isn't that I can read their minds so much as I hypothesis that this is probably what was going on. Now here's the catch. The weird thing, and my wife is an author. She's a published author. Look her book up. It's called Stonefield by Christy Lenzi. A shameless plug. It's a retelling of Wuthering Heights in Civil War, Missouri. So it's really interesting that she has written a book, and people will say, oh, well, you were thinking, and it says more about the person doing the reading than about the author. So there's always a subjectivity here. So when I say Ashurbanipal is probably citing Ludlow, I mean, like a lot of good scholars are going to use these adverbs like maybe, probably, it's very likely, but we're hedging. Because it's impossible to be certain. And guys, I would argue that any time you're doing history, when I reconstruct literary history or when I reconstruct an aspect of social history, I'm working in the sphere of plausibility. I have to. If I had a time machine to videotape it, I would still have to say that my account is subject to my point of view. So there's always going to be plausibility and subjectivity. It's a good question, though. Even though you're calling my judgment into question. That's good, though. That's good.
Okay, I think, it's about time to go home. So thank you for all the questions.